3. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to the Daily Code, episode 6. I'm back from ZenCon, and this is going to be great. Yes, ZenCon was great. I met a lot of really cool people in Las Vegas, and yeah, got to meet people I've only known on Twitter before. So it's always good to put a name to a face, and learnt a lot, and presented a couple really fun talks to do. And so I thought it would be cool to, I don't know, carry on in that same theme. Both my talks were about asynchronous PHP. One was about using libraries and extensions to do it, and the other was about using generators to do it. And it occurred to me it might be a fun topic to try and make some sites in Icicle and to see what it can do. Maybe work our way through some bugs or help contribute to docs or something like that. And I thought a good subject would be to look at the blog that I've got, because at the moment it's just all hosted on Medium, and I've got the stream stuff that's going on and video stuff that's going on, so it would be nice to have a central place for that, to be able to just link to one thing or to link to like shorter URLs or something, because I don't want to paste like a big goofy link in chat the whole time. So the libraries that we're going to be looking at today are in this collection of things. It's this project's called Icicle, and it's got a lot of libraries that I guess you could consider foundational to doing asynchronous stuff in PHP. Things where parts of the language are blocking and synchronous and have been so traditionally, like reading and writing to files, and I mean that's like the biggest thing, and handling concurrent requests really well and resolving DNS stuff. It's all really cool. It's a very new project, so there are, it's working up to the level of functionality that you would find in things like React. And these two gentlemen that work on it, and particularly Aaron, does a fantastic job of it. But it's new, and I like it more than React. I like the fact that it uses generators, and the way that, because there are so few people that have worked on it, all the APIs are very consistent with each other. So you use the file system, and it feels like you're using the same code from the same author of the HTTP system, because you are. But it means that methods are named consistently, and things that you would expect to be there are there, which is cool. I think, I want to talk about how generators work very basically, because they're quite an interesting topic, but they can take a lot of time on their own, like as a whole talk or a whole stream. Let's have a look at this. We're going to be working with HTTP library in Icicle, and this library has client and server, as you can probably tell from these two example files. Let's make this a bit bigger. But the one that we're interested in using tonight or today, I guess, if it's morning for you, good morning. The one we're interested in using today is the HTTP server portion of this. So making code that accepts socket connections and can respond to the browser. Now, if you've been doing PHP or other server-side languages for a while, you may be used to using something like Apache or Nginx to serve requests through. So it acts as the primary receiver of socket connections from browsers through a web server, and it will then serve static files or proxy to other services. And in PHP's case, it spins up the PHP interpreter to handle processing the request through a PHP script. And that's worked really well for a very long time, and for most cases that works fine. But I am kind of interested in the other approach, which is more along the lines of Node.js, where we don't just depend on Apache or Nginx to serve requests to spin up the PHP interpreter. We write the whole web server in PHP. Now, there are arguments for and against doing this kind of thing, and I don't want to go into them right now. I actually just want to make a few production apps using technologies like Icicle and React, particularly Icicle because it doesn't have as much market share as React, and I want to change that. So I'm going to make stuff with Icicle and probably learn along the way ways to improve it and to optimize it and things I should and shouldn't be doing. But it'll be fun to learn anyway, and it'll give me a chance to really dig into doing production stuff with coroutines or generators. So I mentioned generators, and this code, this example code here, uses generators, but how it uses generators is kind of interesting. This looks like a function, right? When we create a new instance of an HTTP server, we feed it this function, and it gets stuff that you would imagine like a request and the associated socket of that request. And you can do things like getting the body of the request and creating new responses. But what's interesting is that this keyword here, this yield keyword, is what makes this function a generator function. And so this was added in PHP 5.5, and what happens when a function is executed that gets to this point, execution stops, or at least, you know, when you execute the function, when you invoke the function, it doesn't return just the return value of that function if it's got the yield keyword in. It returns a thing called a generator. Now, generators have like a bit of history about how they got into the language. Most programming languages have different data types, right? You can have number data types, you can have string data types, you can have Boolean data types, and most of them have the concept of list types or container types or multi-types, most commonly known as arrays or dictionaries or lists. And those generally hold variables of the other types, like multiple of the other types. So you can have a list that holds many booleans, many numbers. You can have lists that hold other lists. In PHP, most of the code you will ever see that works with a list type works with a thing called an array. And it's kind of a hybrid of many different data structures and how it sorts things. And I mean, I guess that's also a potential subject for a different stream or a talk on its own. But the interesting thing with arrays is that, like, they are this hybrid in PHP, and how they, you know, like, they store data similarly to how other languages store this or how other environments store this, that the items within that array are stored in memory. And for small collections of variables, that's okay. That's okay when you're dealing with like 4 options or a user's entered 10 things that they want to have rendered or stored. But when it gets to storing a lot of items in the array, then things can get slow, like with any language, right? The more you load into memory, the slower things can get, the more resources it can take. And so PHP also has this idea of iterators, this type of thing called iterators, which look like a list type in terms of how you access them. I should really be in this mode here. Iterators look like a list type in terms of how you access them, so you can step through each item in an iterator as if you were stepping through each item in an array, but they give the ability to create your own array-like structures. And furthermore, you can do lazy loading with those structures. So I'll give you an example. If you're reading, say you've got like a big file of source code and you want to create line numbers next to each line of code and maybe like add a line break at the end of each line. So you want to render this code out, syntax highlighted in the browser. With traditional PHP and arrays, you can read the file contents, you can split the whole text body by line break, and then you can step through that array and for each line add a line number, and print the line out and add a line break at the end of it. And you can do that, but it means that if you're reading a large file, you read the whole file into memory before you step through each line. So if it's a 5 meg file, you take 5 megs of RAM, and that makes sense. That makes sense if you want to read the whole file in. but it's not the most efficient thing. Like if you want to do lots of operations like this, or you want to do operations quickly, or you want to use as little RAM as possible, as little memory as possible, I should refer to it as, then maybe you don't want to read the whole file into memory. Maybe what you want to do is read line by line until you've reached the end of the file. And for each line, you print that stuff out. Now, you can't do that with normal PHP arrays unless you use them stupidly. Like you can make an array one item big and read a line into it and then write that out and then empty the array. That's done. Or you can use an iterator. You can make a custom iterator that opens a file handle, and each time PHP steps to the next item or moves the internal pointer to the next along, then you can read another line. So you can lazy load stuff, essentially. The trouble is that making iterators, well, I guess it's not really trouble, but there's an interface that you have to implement to get an iterator. So you need a bunch of methods, and there's a lot of boilerplate with doing this, a lot of overhead that you have to keep on doing. Like you have to always implement a key method, which will return the key where the pointer is currently pointing, or the value, or a method for rewinding, a method for checking if there are still items left in the iterator. And you can do this, but it's a lot of overhead every time. Or you can use what's called a generator, which if you create an instance of it, like a generator object, and you check the methods and the properties, it looks almost exactly like an instance of an iterator. It is something that was added to the language to shorten the amount of code, that you need to type in order to get an instance of this iterable thing, this custom list data structure. So how that works is that you make a function and you put a yield keyword in there, and when PHP gets to this point, you make a function and you put the yield keyword in there, and then when PHP gets to this point, it will return what's on the other end of this in the context of iteration. So you'll say something like, for each object as value. When it gets to requesting what that value is, it'll have executed down to this point. It'll return this as the value, and then it'll stop execution at the end of this line. Like this won't, the rest of the stuff will wait until the next iteration of that loop, the next step through. So that's what generators are. They're like a shorthand to creating iterators, and iterators are a way to create custom data types that are iterable. They can be used as arrays can be used. Now, some people have picked up that doing this kind of thing, making a generator and using it in a certain way, allow you to do a kind of asynchronous code. And for language like PHP that's traditionally been very synchronous and blocking, that's a really cool thing. Like, it gives us a way to write code that maybe doesn't execute in parallel, but allows us to interpolate task processing, which is cool because it can be combined with parallel execution. So we can start writing code that looks very synchronous, but is asynchronous. And that's cool. I mean, I think that's cool. So I guess the point of what I'm trying to say is when you see the yield keyword, you need to remember that whatever's on the right-hand side of it is a value that will be there eventually. It's not immediately there. This is a breakpoint in the code, and it will resume when this thing on the right-hand side resolves. Okay? Different libraries have different ways of expressing that. Some use a PHP promise implementation, some use coroutines, some use all sorts of stuff. But this just means, okay, execution stopping here, this value will eventually come through. Now, we can assign this thing to a variable, and generators don't work exactly like that. They work slightly differently, but the code in Icicle is set up to allow you to be able to get this value